Marcus Hale had fixed toys for 31 years without a single day of regret. It wasn't the kind of work that earned a man a standing ovation or a feature in the local paper, at least not anymore. In his younger days, a toy repairman was a fixture of the neighborhood, as necessary as the cobbler or the tailor. Someone you called when something your child loved had broken and the tears weren't stopping. But the world had shifted beneath his feet somewhere along the way, quietly and without apology, and now people bought cheap and threw away cheaper, and the idea of repairing something instead of replacing it had become almost quaint. A word people used when they meant old-fashioned, but were trying to be polite about it. Marcus didn't mind being old-fashioned. He minded very little, truth be told. His small shop on Brennan Street was the last of its kind in a neighborhood that strip malls had swallowed whole. On his left, where the hardware store had stood for 40 years, there was now a phone repair chain with a glowing logo and a teenager behind the counter who looked faintly bored at all times. On his right, a vape shop pumped sweet-smelling air onto the sidewalk, where the old diner used to serve eggs and coffee to men in work boots before the morning shift. Marcus had eaten at that diner more times than he could count. He still missed it on cold mornings. But Hale's Toy Repair held its ground, the hand-painted sign above the door weathered to a dignified gray, the window display a quiet museum of rescued things, a tin robot from the 50s, a pull-string bear with new eyes, and a model train that ran smooth and silent on a small oval of track. He was 63 now, tired in his knees when the rain came in, slower on the stairs than he used to be. His reading glasses had gotten thicker 2 prescriptions in a row, but his hands, the careful, knowing hands that had brought 10,000 broken things back to life, were never once tired. Those, the years had left alone. On a cold Tuesday, his old landline rang with a voice he didn't recognize. Marcus was at his workbench when it happened, halfway through restringing the pull mechanism on a cloth rabbit that a 4-year-old somewhere was presumably devastated without. The phone, a real one, corded, the kind with actual weight to it, sat on the corner of the counter beside a jar of pencils and a coffee mug that had long since given up being warm. He let it ring twice out of habit, wiped his hands on his work cloth, and picked up. "Hale's Toy Repair," he said, the same way he'd said it for 31 years. The voice on the other end was older, female, and measured in a way that reminded Marcus of his own mother in her later years, every word placed with deliberate care, as though speech were a resource to be spent wisely. As she introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Voss, she apologized for calling without a referral. She said she had found his number in a phone directory, which told Marcus 2 things immediately, that she was of a certain generation and that she was thorough. Then she told him about the music box. She spoke carefully, too carefully, Marcus thought, the kind of careful that comes not from shyness, but from bracing, like someone who has already knocked on enough doors to know that the next one might not open either. There was a dignity in her voice that she was clearly working to maintain, and beneath it, quiet and patient, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been told no too many times by people who should have said yes. 3 other shops, she said. None of them touched music boxes anymore. She said it without accusation. A just fact. The way people report weather. The music box had belonged to her late daughter. Before that, to her late husband. It hadn't played in years, and she wanted very much for it to play again before... She paused there, briefly, before too much more time passed. Marcus had heard that pause before. He knew exactly what it held. "I do music boxes," he said. "Tell me your address." Marcus wrote down her address without hesitation and told her he'd come Thursday morning. He used the small notepad he kept beside the phone, the same brand he'd been buying from the same office supply store for 20 years. Yellow, spiral-bound at the top, the kind that fit in a shirt pocket. He wrote Mrs. Eleanor Voss in his careful block letters, then the address, then music box, mechanism with a small asterisk beside it, the way he always marked jobs that would need his finer tools. He tore the sheet off, folded it once, and tucked it under the corner of the coffee mug where he kept his important papers and where Gloria had given up trying to impose order long ago. He said goodbye to Mrs. Voss and set the phone back in its cradle. For a moment he stood at the counter and looked at nothing in particular, and the way a man does when something small has settled into him and he's giving it room to sit. The address was on the far edge of town, past the reservoir, in one of those neighborhoods with long driveways and old trees and houses that had been standing long enough to have opinions about architecture. Not the usual territory for a call like this. But grief, Marcus had learned, didn't confine itself to zip codes. He turned back toward the workbench. Gloria was in her chair by the front window, the one she'd claimed as her reading spot the year he finally talked her into spending her afternoons at the shop with him rather than alone at home. She had a book open in her lap and her glasses pushed up into her silver hair, and she was looking at him with that expression. The patient, knowing smile she had spent decades quietly perfecting, and the one that saw straight through him without ever being unkind about what it found. "Another one?" she said. "Music box," he said. "Past the reservoir. Shouldn't take long." The smile didn't waver, didn't need to. "You always say it won't take long," she said. He didn't argue. He never did anymore, not about this, because 31 years of marriage had taught him the same thing 31 years of toy repair had, that some people simply know more than you do, and the wisest thing a man can do is stop pretending otherwise. She was always right, about the time, about the jobs, about him. He picked up the cloth rabbit and went back to work. Thursday came gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter over the reservoir road. Marcus left the shop at 8:30, earlier than he needed to, because he had never once been late to a job in 31 years and had no intention of starting now. Gloria had packed him a thermos of coffee without being asked, the way she had done every cold morning for as long as either of them could reliably remember, and he set it on the passenger seat beside his tool bag and pulled out of Brennan Street, while the neighborhood was still quiet and the vape shop next door still dark behind its glass. The drive took him out past the edges of town where the streets gradually stopped pretending to be streets and became roads instead, wider, quieter, lined with bare November trees that stood like patient sentinels on either side of the asphalt. The reservoir appeared on his left after a few miles, flat and silver-gray under the overcast sky, its surface barely moving, holding the color of the clouds so perfectly that the horizon between water and sky nearly disappeared. Marcus had always liked that stretch of road. It reminded him that the world was still large in places, still unhurried, still capable of a certain indifferent beauty that had nothing to do with anyone's plans. He drove with the thermos between his knees and the heater running low and the radio off, the way he preferred on job mornings. Quiet helped him think. Quiet helped him arrive at a house already settled in himself, already ready, which was half the work of any repair before the tools even came out of the bag. That his worn leather tool bag sat on the passenger seat with the easy familiarity of an old traveling companion. The brass clasps were dulled from decades of opening and closing. He had polished them once, years ago, and then decided he preferred them this way, honest about their age. He found the house without a single wrong turn. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway behind a row of ancient oak trees, their bare branches knitting together overhead like the arched ceiling of something that had once been a cathedral and remembered it. The house itself was a white colonial, tall and immaculate, its paint fresh against the gray morning, its grounds tended with the quiet precision of someone who still believed that care was its own form of dignity. Marcus parked, picked up his bag, and walked toward the front door. He rang the bell and waited, expecting a housekeeper or a slow-moving elderly woman. That was the natural assumption, and Marcus was a man who dealt in natural assumptions the way he dealt in everything else, practically, without drama, based on available evidence. Mrs. Eleanor Voss had sounded 70 at least, possibly older. The house suggested old money and older habits. The long driveway, the oak trees, the freshly painted colonial with its careful grounds, all of it pointed toward a certain kind of Thursday morning answer at the door. A woman in a cardigan, perhaps. Someone hired to manage the house. A daughter visiting from out of town. He stood on the porch with his tool bag at his feet and his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and listened to the silence of the neighborhood around him. No traffic, no voices, then just the faint movement of bare branches overhead and the distant sound of a crow somewhere beyond the tree line. The door opened, and Marcus Hale looked up. The figure in the doorway was enormous, not in the soft, rounded way of a large person, but in the way of something built on a different set of assumptions about what a body needed to be. Nearly 7 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, filling the frame the way a door is meant to be filled, as though the space had always been intended for exactly this. The skin was a deep gray-green, smooth in some places and faintly textured in others, like river stone that had been worn patient by long years of moving water. The head was slightly larger than a human head, the brow ridge heavy and deliberate, the jaw strong and set with a quietness that had nothing of aggression in it. And the eyes, large, amber, luminous in the gray morning light, looked down at Marcus with an expression that was careful and still, and above all, watchful. Not threatening, not cold, simply present, the way very few people ever learn to be. The figure stood without fidgeting, without filling the silence unnecessarily, without any of the small compensating movements humans make when they know they are being looked at and feel uncertain about what is being seen. It was perfectly, completely still. Marcus stood on the porch in the November cold and looked up, and the world held its breath for just a moment around them both. Marcus adjusted his glasses, looked at the address on his paper, and looked back up again. It was not a gesture of doubt exactly. The house was clearly the right house, the driveway the right driveway, the number on the post at the end of the gravel path matching what he had written in his careful block letters on his yellow notepad Tuesday afternoon. It was something else, a small private ritual of grounding, the kind a practical man performs when the world briefly steps outside the boundaries of what he had prepared for, and he needs a single quiet moment to absorb the adjustment without making a scene of it. He had served in no wars. He had traveled to no exotic places. He had lived his 63 years on a relatively short stretch of the Earth's surface, fixing broken things and loving his wife, and watching the neighborhood change around him one storefront at a time. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who had been prepared by his life's experience for the figure currently occupying the doorway above him. But he was also not a man who believed that being unprepared for something was a reason to behave badly about it. He folded the paper, put it back in his coat pocket, looked up. "Mrs. Voss?" he said. Because a man with a job to do asks the practical question first. Because the practical question was the honest one, and because standing on a porch in the cold making no sound at all would help precisely nobody, least of all an elderly woman somewhere inside the house who had called 3 shops before his and been turned away by all of them. The amber eyes regarded him with that same patient stillness. When the figure spoke, the voice was low and resonant, each word given its full weight and no more, placed into the cold morning air with the deliberate care of someone who had learned language thoughtfully and refused to spend it carelessly. "She is my grandmother," the figure said. "She is unwell today and could not come to the door herself." A pause. Brief, unhurried. "I am Sarath. She asked me to receive you." Marcus nodded once. A single, complete nod, the kind that means understood and thank you, and let's get on with it all at once, without wasting any of them. "Marcus Hale," he said. "I'm here about the music box." Marcus nodded once and stepped inside without missing a beat. It was the only appropriate response, and he knew it the same way he knew which screwdriver to reach for without looking, through the accumulated instinct of a man who had spent decades walking into strangers' homes with a tool bag and a purpose. He had stepped into houses that smelled of illness, and houses that smelled of fresh paint, and houses where the silence had the particular weight of recent argument, and houses where 3 dogs hit him at the knees before he reached the mat. He had learned over 31 years that the threshold was never the place to hesitate. Hesitation at the threshold helped no one and unnerved everyone. And Marcus Hale had not driven out past the reservoir on a cold Thursday morning to make an elderly woman feel that her home required an apology. He stepped inside, and Sarath closed the door behind him with a quietness that was almost remarkable for hands that large. The warmth of the interior hit him gently, not the aggressive heat of a thermostat pushed too high by someone old and cold-blooded, but a deep, even warmth, the kind that lives in walls and floors and has been there long enough to become simply the nature of the place. The smell was cedar and something faintly floral beneath it, soft and uninsistent, like a memory of a garden rather than the garden itself. Marcus looked around without making a production of it. The ceilings were high, higher than the exterior of the house had suggested, and which meant someone had done significant interior work at some point. The doorways were wider than standard, their frames rebuilt with care, the woodwork matching the original molding so closely that only someone looking for the difference would find it. The furniture was human in its basic shapes, but arranged with a generous spaciousness that spoke of inhabitants who needed room to move without apology. Everything had been thought about. Everything had been adapted with quiet, unhurried consideration. This was not a house where someone was merely tolerated. This was a home where people, all of them in whatever shape they came, belonged completely. The hallway stretched ahead of him toward the sitting room, and along its walls, in mismatched frames of different sizes and different woods, ran the photographs. Marcus walked slowly, following Sarath's broad back, and let his eyes move across them as he passed. Eleanor Voss appeared in many of them, small, white-haired, sharp-eyed, her posture carrying the particular dignity of a woman who had decided long ago what she believed and had never found sufficient reason to revise it. In the earlier photographs, she was younger, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame. In the later ones, she was seated most often, surrounded by the tall, gray-green figures the way a woman is surrounded by her family. Without self-consciousness, without performance, with the simple and complete ease, the music box sat on a small table by the window, carved wood inlaid with climbing roses. Sarath led him into the sitting room and stepped aside without ceremony, and Marcus saw it immediately. Not because it was large or ostentatious, but because it had the particular quality of something that had been placed with great care in exactly the right spot. The table was positioned near the window where the gray morning light fell across it evenly, and the music box sat at the center of that light as though it had always been there, as though the table and the window and the light had all been arranged around it rather than the other way around. It was beautiful in the way that old handmade things are beautiful, not perfectly, not showily, but honestly. The wooden case was dark with age. Its lacquer cracked in fine networks across the surface, the way old glaze cracks on pottery, which only added to it rather than taking anything away. The inlay work was extraordinary. Climbing roses worked into the panels in a lighter wood, their petals and leaves following the grain with the kind of patient craftsmanship that assumed the person doing the work had all the time in the world and intended to use it well. A brass key protruded from the side, dulled but intact. The lid was closed. Inside, visible through the small gap at the hinge, the silhouette of a ballerina waited in the dark, frozen mid-turn, her paint worn to a softness that made her look less like a toy and more like something dreamed. Marcus set his tool bag on the floor beside the table and sat in the chair Sarath had quietly positioned for him. Another thing the large figure had done without being asked, without announcement, with the same unhurried consideration that seemed to govern everything in this house. He reached into the bag and retrieved his magnifying visor, the one Gloria called his serious face, and fitted it over his glasses with the ease of 10,000 prior fittings. He looked at the music box for a moment without touching it. He always did this. It was the part of the work no one saw and no one asked about. The brief, quiet act of looking before touching, of giving the broken thing the courtesy of being seen whole before being opened up. Then he unlatched the base panel with a thin tool and swung it carefully open. And he looked inside with practiced calm, the visor bringing the mechanism into sharp relief against the dim interior of the case. It took him less than 30 seconds to understand the problem completely. A single tine on the comb had bent at its base, not broken, just deflected, nudged out of true by some long-ago impact or by the slow, patient pressure of time and temperature, and the house settling around it over decades. And there, lodged between two teeth of the brass cylinder, a small fragment of debris. He couldn't immediately identify what it had once been, sitting precisely where it would stop everything. Routine. Completely and auntie. Sarath settled into the large chair across from him and watched with unblinking amber patience. The chair was one of two oversized ones positioned near the window, the kind of furniture that looked custom rather than bought, built for a frame that standard catalogs didn't accommodate. Sarath folded into it with a natural ease that suggested this was a habitual spot, a place worn familiar by regular use, and then simply became still in the way that Marcus had already begun to recognize as characteristic. Not the stillness of someone suppressing movement, not the effortful quiet of a person trying to appear calm. Something older than that, something that came from a different relationship with time and silence than most people Marcus had ever met possessed. The amber eyes settled on him and stayed there. Marcus didn't mind being watched while he worked. Some people found it uncomfortable. The awareness of observation tightening their hands, making their movements self-conscious and stiff. But Marcus had worked under the eyes of anxious parents and grieving grandparents and hovering collectors for 3 decades, and he had long ago made his peace with it. Being watched meant someone cared about the outcome. That was never a bad thing. He selected his finest pick from the roll of tools laid open beside the bag and held it up to the window light. Examining the point with the same careful attention he gave every tool before it touched something irreplaceable. The silence between them stretched out and settled, easy and undemanding on both sides. Then Sarath spoke. "You are not frightened." The voice was low even, by carrying no particular accusation or wonder, simply an observation offered plainly, the way one might note the weather or the time. Marcus turned the pick once more in the light, satisfied with what he saw, and lowered it toward the cylinder with a steady hand. "I've got a job," he said. "That's enough." He meant it with the complete simplicity it sounded like. There was no bravery being performed, no deliberate display of open-mindedness for an audience of one. There was a bent tine and a fragment of debris and a music box that hadn't played in years, and an elderly woman somewhere in the back rooms of this house who wanted very much to hear it sing again before too much more time passed. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Albeit a man with work in front of him and the right tools in his hand didn't have room left over for fear, and Marcus Hale had never believed he did. He set the pick to the cylinder and began. He worked for 40 minutes with the focus of a man who had never needed an audience. This was perhaps the truest thing about Marcus Hale that most people never got close enough to see. In conversation, he was warm, unhurried, genuinely interested in the people who brought him their broken things and the stories those things carried. But the moment his hands found the work, something in him went quiet and inward in a way that had nothing to do with rudeness and everything to do with a kind of devotion that didn't require witness. The shop could be empty or full. The room could be silent or loud. It made no difference. Once Marcus was inside a repair, he was simply inside it, the way a diver is inside water. Completely, with the world above becoming secondary and remote. He worked through the mechanism methodically, the way he always did, from the outside in and from the obvious toward the subtle, never assuming the first problem found was the only problem worth finding. The bent tine came first. He reached into the roll of tools and found the one he wanted without looking. A slender, beautiful instrument, its handle worn smooth by 3 sets of hands across 2 generations, its tip ground to a tolerance that modern tools rarely bothered with anymore. His grandfather had been a watchmaker in a small town that no longer existed under that name, and when he died, he had left Marcus 3 things: a piece of advice Marcus had never forgotten, a photograph Marcus kept in his wallet, and this tool, which Marcus had used on every delicate job for 30 years and intended to use until one of them gave out. He applied it to the base of the bent tine with a pressure so controlled it was closer to suggestion than force, coaxing the metal back toward true in increments too small to see but possible to feel, checking after each micro-adjustment with the visor, and the patience of a man who understood that hurrying a piece of brass that had been bent for years would only teach it to bend again. It came true, slowly, then completely. He cleared the debris from the cylinder teeth next. 3 careful passes with the pick, each one lifting a little more of whatever the fragment had once been. Paper, perhaps, or a dried petal, impossibly fragile, impossibly lodged, until the teeth were clean and the path between them unobstructed. Then the oil. A single drop from the small vial he kept wrapped in chamois in the corner of the bag. I applied to the spring barrel with the tip of a pin, no more than was needed and not a fraction beyond. He closed the base panel, checked the key, found the tension sound. Then he wound it, 7 slow turns, feeling the spring take each one and hold it, feeling the mechanism come alive beneath his fingers the way a sleeping thing comes alive when it recognizes it is being called back rather than forced. He set the box upright on the table. He looked at it for one moment in the gray morning light. Then he opened the mechanism caught, the cylinder turned, and the waltz rose into the gray November room. It happened the way the best things happen, without announcement, without build-up, without any of the ceremonial hesitation that would have made it feel performed. One moment there was silence, and the next moment there was music, thin and sweet and ancient, climbing into the air of the sitting room the way light climbs into a space when a curtain is drawn back. Not flooding in, not rushing, simply arriving, the way something arrives that has always belonged there and has merely been absent for a while. The notes were clear and true. Whatever 40 years and a bent tine and a fragment of debris had done to the silence inside that box, the music itself had survived it perfectly, and waiting with the patient fidelity of something that understood its own purpose and had never doubted it would be needed again. The waltz filled the room, filled it the way only simple music in a quiet space can fill a room, taking up not just the air, but something less definable. Something that lives in the chest and behind the eyes, and in the particular quality of stillness that falls over people when they hear a thing that reaches past their defenses without effort or intention. And the little ballerina spun. She turned on her small platform with the slow, dreaming grace of something restored to its element, her worn paint catching the gray window light in a way that made her look less faded and more softened, as though time had not diminished her but simply given her a gentleness she hadn't started with. But her colors, whatever they had once been, pink perhaps or white, had blurred at their edges into something quieter and more beautiful than precision. She turned and turned, and the music carried her, and she seemed to remember without effort or struggle exactly what she had always been made to do. Marcus sat back from the table and watched her. He did this at the end of every repair, this brief, private moment of watching the fixed thing be itself again, of giving it a few seconds of witness before the practical world resumed. It was not a habit he had ever spoken about to anyone, not even Gloria, because some things are so close to the center of a person that language feels like the wrong tool for them. The familiar satisfaction settled in his chest like a coal finding its heat, slow, deep, irradiating outward from some central place that never seemed to cool completely between jobs, only banked itself and waited. 31 years of this feeling, and it had never once gotten smaller. If anything, he thought, watching the ballerina turn in the November light, it had gotten larger, as though the accumulation of all the broken things made whole had been building toward something, adding itself to itself year after year, and he was only now, at 63, beginning to understand the full size of what he had spent his life doing. He let the waltz play on He looked up and saw Sarath gone completely still, amber eyes fixed on the spinning figure. It was a different stillness than before. The earlier quiet had been the stillness of patience, of watchful and unhurried attention. The stillness of a person at rest within themselves. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone who had been stopped mid-motion by something they hadn't fully prepared themselves for. Caught between the present moment and somewhere much further back, held there by 8 small notes repeating in a pattern their body apparently knew before their mind had finished recognizing it. The amber eyes had not blinked. They were fixed on the ballerina with an expression that Marcus had seen before. Not on this face, not in these eyes, but not in anything remotely resembling this particular person. But in the essential shape of it, yes, absolutely. He had seen it on the face of a man in his 50s who had brought in a toy fire truck that had belonged to his son. He had seen it on a grandmother holding a music box, much like this one, while Marcus worked on the mechanism, her eyes going somewhere his hands couldn't follow. He had seen it on a young woman who hadn't cried until the toy rabbit he'd repaired actually moved its ears again, and then had cried in the particular helpless way of someone who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. Grief wore the same face in the end, regardless of the face it wore it on. Marcus said nothing, and he had learned that silence was often the most skilled thing he could offer at moments like this, that filling the air with words was sometimes just a way of making the witness more comfortable at the expense of the person who needed the moment to simply be what it was. The waltz played on, and then Sarath spoke. The voice was still low, still measured, still placing each word with that characteristic deliberate care, but something inside it had come loose, not broken, not unraveled, simply loosened, the way a knot loosens when the tension that has been holding it finally, gently, eases. "My mother loved this song," the figure said. The amber eyes did not move from the spinning ballerina. "She would wind it on Sunday mornings before the rest of the house was awake. We would hear it from the other rooms, from wherever we were sleeping, wherever we had settled for the night, and we would know. We would know she was awake, and that the morning was beginning, and that everything was as it should be." The waltz filled the silence between the words. "We did not always come immediately," Sarath continued, quieter now. "Sometimes we lay still and just listened, because the music meant she was there, and as long as it was playing, we did not have to be anywhere except exactly where we were." Marcus sat with his hands folded in his lap and listened and did not move. Outside, the November wind moved through tea. "How long has she been gone?" Marcus asked. He asked it the way he asked everything, quietly, without decoration, looking at Sarath directly because the question deserved that much, and the person being asked deserved more than a man who couldn't meet their eyes when the conversation turned toward something real. He had learned over decades of sitting in strangers' sitting rooms with broken things between them that people who were carrying grief almost never needed to be handled carefully. What they needed was to be taken seriously. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously, and most people never quite located it. The waltz continued its slow revolution in the space between them. The ballerina turned. Sarath's amber eyes moved at last from the music box and found his, and Marcus held the gaze without difficulty, and without the faint involuntary discomfort that he suspected most people felt, and most people tried to hide, and almost none of them managed to hide completely. He felt none of it. He saw only what the eyes contained, which was the same thing he had seen in 10,000 human eyes across 31 years of work, the enormous, patient, unresolvable weight of having loved someone who was no longer there to be loved in return. 4 years, Sarath said. 2 words. Flat and complete, the way certain true things are flat and complete, requiring nothing added to them because they already contain everything they need to contain. 4 years of Sunday mornings without music. 4 years of waking in a house where the sound that meant safety and belonging and the simple animal comfort of knowing someone you loved was awake and nearby. Where that sound simply did not come anymore, and the silence in its place was a shape you learned to live around without ever quite learning to stop noticing. Marcus nodded. He let the 2 words sit for a moment in the room, giving them the space they had earned. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Plain and short. No elaboration, no pivot toward silver linings, no gentle suggestion that time had a way of softening these things, no reaching for the particular brand of comfort that is really just the comforter's own discomfort in disguise. He had watched people do that his whole life, rush toward the grief of others with words like men rushing toward a fire with their coats, and trying to smother it, trying to make it smaller, trying to reach the moment on the other side of it as quickly as possible. Marcus had never believed that was what grief needed. Grief needed to be acknowledged, seen, given its correct name and its correct weight by someone willing to hold both for a moment without flinching. So he said he was sorry, and he meant it with the full and simple sincerity of a man who had buried his own parents and held his wife through her own losses and understood in his bones that sorrow was not a problem to be solved, but a testament to be respected. The waltz played softly on between them. Sarath walked him to the door and paused at the threshold with something unnameable in those amber eyes. Marcus had written the invoice by hand on his small carbon copy slip, the same pale green forms he had ordered from the same printer for 15 years, his name and number printed across the top in plain block letters. He had placed it on the table beside the music box without comment, and Sarath had looked at the amount and then looked at him with an expression suggesting that the number was considerably lower than expected. Marcus had said it was what he charged, in the tone he used when the subject was closed, and Sarath had accepted this with a small nod that carried a great deal of dignity in a very small gesture. He had packed his tools back into the leather bag with the same methodical care he always used. Each instrument returned to its exact place in the roll tied, the bag clasped. He had given the music box one last look, still playing on the table in the gray light, the ballerina still turning, the waltz still unspooling into the warm cedar-scented air of the sitting room. Then he had picked up the bag and followed Sarath back down the hallway lined with photographs and through the widened doorways toward the front of the house. Now they stood at the threshold, and the cold came in around them from outside, and Marcus had his coat buttoned and his bag in his hand and was ready in every practical sense to leave. But Sarath had paused, and in the pause was something that Marcus recognized the shape of without being able to name its precise color or texture. Something that lived in the space between gratitude and need, between the relief of having been helped and the quiet fear of whether help would be available again. He had seen it before, at other doors, on other faces, at the end of other jobs that had turned out to be about more than the broken thing that had prompted the call. It was the look of someone asking a question they hadn't yet found the words for. Then Sarath found them. "If grandmother has other broken things," the figure said quietly, each word given its full and careful weight. "May we call again?" The amber eyes held his with a directness that had nothing of demand in it, and everything of genuine uncertainty. The uncertainty of someone who had learned, through sufficient experience, that the answer to this particular kind of question was not always yes, and who had decided to ask anyway because the alternative was not asking, and that was worse. Marcus pulled his coat against the cold that came through the open door. He looked up at the amber eyes for a moment, at the figure filling the doorway of the warm house with the hallway photographs behind it and the waltz still faintly audible from the sitting room, and felt something settle in him that was adjacent to the satisfaction of the repair, but not quite the same thing. Quieter, more permanent. That's what the number's for. He drove home through the gray afternoon, past the reservoir, back to Brennan Street and Gloria's waiting tea. The road back felt different from the road out, the way return journeys always feel different. Not shorter exactly, but more settled. The landscape familiar now in both directions rather than just one. The reservoir appeared on his right this time, its silver surface unchanged, still holding the sky's color with that same quiet fidelity. And Marcus drove past it with the heater running low and the thermos empty on the passenger seat and his tool bag beside it, clasps done up, work finished, the whole morning contained now inside the leather like something folded and put away. He thought about the music box. He thought about the ballerina turning in the gray window light, her worn paint catching it softly, and her small mechanism doing precisely and without complaint the thing it had been built to do. The thing it had always known how to do, even through the years of silence, even through the bent tine and the lodged debris and the long, patient dark of the closed lid. It had simply waited. It had held its purpose inside itself and waited for someone to come along with the right tools and enough care and the willingness to sit down and look before touching. He thought about Sarath standing in the doorway with those amber eyes full of something that had no clean English name, but that Marcus understood completely in the wordless language of 31 years spent sitting with people and their broken things and the grief those things carried. He thought about Eleanor Voss somewhere in the back rooms of that white colonial house, listening. He turned onto Brennan Street as the afternoon light began to thin toward evening, his shop appearing on the left, with its weathered sign and its window display, and its stubborn, unchanged presence at the end of the block. Gloria would be inside. There would be tea. She would look up with that knowing smile and ask how it went, and he would sit down across from her and wrap both hands around the warm mug and think for a moment before answering. Not because the answer was complicated, but because some things deserved a moment of genuine consideration before being reduced to words, even the true and simple ones. He parked, picked up his bag, walked to the door. Routine, he would tell her, and mean it as the highest possible praise.